And it is a great pleasure to welcome to the program Carl Sagan, who has surely been here many times before, and Ann Druyan, who has been here at least once before. They are, as you may well know, husband and wife. They are the authors of the new book, Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, a search for who we are. And as good a way, Ann, to begin our conversation about this book as any, is to talk about the art on the cover.
Well,
Describe that lovely illustration and then explain it.
It depicts a newborn baby in a basket, naked, and this has to do with the central metaphor of the book, which is that the human species, in a way, is that newborn baby on the doorstep to the universe. But we didn't come with a note, and what science has been doing over the last couple of hundred years has been making an attempt to reconstruct that orphan's file, that missing data that tells us who we are, where we came from, who our ancestors were, and to what degree they influence who we are right now.
All right, I will bite. Who are we exactly? Or rather, how does one begin to tell the story that leads up to this orphan landing on the doorstep of... Whose doorstep is that, by the way?
It's the doorstep to the universe, I guess. This book was begun in the height of the Cold War, when we seemed to be on the verge of a fateful interaction between the national ambitions and rivalries of the United States and the Soviet Union, and a world with 60,000 nuclear weapons in it. And Annie and I were concerned to understand how we had gotten into that mess and related messes, and how to get out, or could we get out. And I must admit, when we first started out, I thought maybe it would take us back to the origins of the United States and the then Soviet Union. But instead, we were led on a much longer quest into much deeper time.
It took you back at least to the origins of this solar system, if not the total universe.
Yes. So, you know, you want to understand national rivalries, okay, go back to the origin of the nation state, but that's only 10,000 years ago, or even less. Humans did not get formed in our present with our present set of disabilities and virtues then. We were the same long before that. And before we knew it, we were not only in the vast expanse of hunter-gatherer time that preceded civilization, but before that, looking at our non-human primate ancestors, and even before that, because so many of our sensibilities and virtues and vices come from the long evolutionary history that our species has experienced.
We are here tonight to talk essentially biology and psychology. That is, we're here to talk about evolution and the evolution of man and what has become of him and what he and she are capable of, and what dilemmas we carry with us by virtue of our inheritance, that inheritance being one that we share with the other high primates, the other anthropoid apes, who are off the same common stock, though they are not our direct descendants.
Or ancestors.
Or ancestors. Did I say descendants? I meant ancestors, of course, nor are we their descendants. But properly to go at all of this, one has to, of course, account for the very emergence of life, or perhaps even for the very emergence of matter. You, Carl, have two identities. You are essentially known to the world as a cosmologist and an astronomer, but you are also well trained in the biological sciences and have always had that interest. Indeed, your book, The Dragons of Eden, which won the Pulitzer Prize, do I have the title correct? Was essentially an account of another aspect of our evolution. A crucial question, going back to your astronomer or cosmologist identity, is it true, in fact, that every molecule of matter that presently exists, in a sense, always existed, though not in molecular form?
Well, if you ask, does every atom that's in our body or on the
That would
Earth,
come closer, yes.
did that once exist somewhere else? Except for a small number which are the products of radioactive decay. That is, they had parents who were different kinds of atoms. Except for that.
But all the matter that there is has always been, in a sense.
In a way. We have to distinguish between the kind of stuff that was here at the time of the Big Bang, mainly hydrogen and helium, and all the stuff that has come to be since then. Come to be where? In the hot interiors of red giant stars and in supernova explosions. That's a kind of stellar alchemy that cooks atoms from the simpler ones, hydrogen and helium, to the more complex ones like carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, which are essential for life and still heavier elements.
But how do such atoms, Anne, turn into organic beings? Not yet the human being, but how do they turn into even unicellular organisms? What's the secret of the origin of life itself?
How did life get started? Well, that's such a profound question, and I'm not equipped actually to answer that question. I would be a fool, in fact, to answer it with Carl sitting here. This was really much more his field than mine.
Then you yield to Carl.
I yield to my learned and wonderful colleague.
I will yield back on many issues later. Well, life on Earth is an expression of the remarkable capability of certain kinds of molecules. The nucleic acids, of which DNA is the most famous variety, which contains all our hereditary information, all the information which determines, let's say, what our children shall look like, and many of their hereditary predispositions are encoded in a language of about 4 billion letters, if I can use that word. And everyone else's heredity is determined by a different sequence, slightly different sequence of 4 billion letters. So to some extent, the origin of life is a question which reduces to the origin of these key molecules. And the proteins, which are the means by which nucleic acids reach out into the world and determine what is happening. So the characteristic way you approach this is you start out with what you think is the primitive atmosphere of the Earth. You apply energy in the form of the equivalent of lightning or charged particles or shock waves from incoming comets. And lo and behold, in the laboratory, you find all of the simple building blocks of the nucleic acids and the proteins dropping out like manna from heaven.
You say, lo and behold, in the laboratory. That was a laboratory at the University of Chicago.
The original experiment was done by Stanley Miller under the direction of Harold Urey in 1952-53 at the University of Chicago.
Where they generated nucleic acids.
Where they generated amino acids, the building blocks of proteins. And since then, the building blocks of nucleic acids have been generated. And another important aspect of this, which we do talk about in Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, is that we now find that, for example, comets are loaded with organic matter. They're, in fact, 25% organic matter. We know that comets hit the Earth even today. Back at the time of the origin of the Earth, about 4.5 billion years ago, they were hitting the Earth at an enormous rate, and some of those comets and cometary debris survived the impact, and the organic matter contributed, again, in a different way, to the origin of life.
What you really have just sneaked in is a confirmation of what is sometimes called the panspermia hypothesis, or at least a version of it. Francis Crick and others have argued that life has also originated outside or off this planet and has landed on this planet.
Important distinction. What I was just talking about was the arrival of preformed organic molecules, not life. What Francis Crick and others, going back to a Swedish chemist named Arrhenius in the 19th century, were talking about, is the arrival of life itself. That, to my mind, solves nothing. It merely postpones dealing with the question of the origin of life. Back. And there's no evidence for life coming in uncommon.
Life begins someplace perhaps as long ago as 4 billion years, is that right?
Yes.
When does complex life of the sort that we ultimately descend from?
Well, that was it, 4 billion years ago. I mean, those first organisms are our most distant ancestors.
Of course, yes.
We come from them.
And already, with those first organisms, you see the beginning of consciousness, which was something I find very striking.
How can we know that? You mean a unicellular organism has consciousness?
These organisms have to make some very critical decisions. One is, I digest you, I do not digest me. Mm-hmm. And there is I and thou, right there at the very beginning, this first awareness that there is a difference between me and everything else. Is
it awareness, or is it merely ordered sort of biochemically and mechanically?
Is our awareness awareness, or is it merely biochemical?
Are you sure there's a difference?
No, I'm not. I'm truly not. And of course, that's an eternal philosophical and ultimately neuroanatomical argument.
Yes, and it runs right through all of our philosophical traditions, this question. Over and over again, you see the pillars of Western philosophy going back, Plato, Aristotle, through Kant, Rousseau,
Yeah.
all of them. And they're all very willing to immediately say that there's a distinction between what all the other living beings, their consciousness and their awareness, and ours. A difference
Yes.
not in degree, but in kind. We have awareness, we have consciousness, they have something biochemical.
And as we jump forward, we come to the basic question of how we differ, if at all, from our very close animal relatives, who are the very high anthropoid, man-like apes, the chimps, the orangs, the gorillas, the bonobos, and so on. And we need to talk about that a good deal, and we will. Your book deals with that in an utterly fascinating way. Indeed, I must instantly add that this book is totally fascinating from the very beginning to the very end, and yet it's the first volume of what may be a series or may just be...
3 volumes.
You contemplate
Projected
3 volumes.
3 volumes.
Because you take this book really up to the dawn of the emergence of the human
humans.
species.
That's right.
The book in question is Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, the publisher's Random House, and we've got some commercials coming, but when we return, and before we get to man and the other apes, we need to talk about a central figure. You do a few chapters on him. He's one of the most interesting people in the history of science, the history of human thought and achievement. That is, of course, Charles Darwin, and evolution is the key to this whole story, and his formulation of the basic theory of evolution is one of those great leaps forward in human ideation, which has made a change in everything since just the middle of the last century. So, we return instantly to Carl Sagan, to Ann Druyan, and to Charles Darwin after we pause for these words.
Moderator, Milton Rosenberg.
And we return to Ann Druyan and Carl Sagan, who are the co-authors of Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, A Search for Who We Are. That is published by Random House. It's a wonderful book, superbly written, draws from many sources, full of very valuable explanation and explication of the relevant areas of science, relevant to accounting for our origins and the origin of life, and for that matter, the origin of the solar system within which life occurred. But you will both agree, of course, because this is evident from your book, that when it comes to discerning and somehow seeing through the shadows of our forgotten ancestors and getting back to the full detail of the story of our origins, a crucial figure, the basic seer through the darkness, is Charles Darwin.
There's no question that before Charles Darwin, our past was kind of like a deep, dirty secret, a dark secret. And Charles Darwin did so many things for us as a civilization. One thing is that before Darwin, of course, the story seemed to be only a few thousand years long. And of course, with his great perception, that expanded it to the many billions of years that we now know. We now know the story really.
The common received wisdom, at least for those who were more or less orthodox in their religious convictions in the Western world, was that all of creation was it either 8,000 or 10,000 years old. It had been figured out by Bishop Ussher, who took the genealogies given in the Old Testament, and he went backwards on the begats.
That's right.
Came to Adam and Eve.
And the wonderful thing about Charles Darwin, the reason we love Charles Darwin so, is that he's right out of a Frank Capra movie.
How so?
Because he doesn't come to this issue to burn down the barn, to kick the door in, to upset people and their religious beliefs. Instead, he comes as a believer. He was going to be a parson.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But he's an honest man with tremendous curiosity and really remarkable self-discipline. And when he sees that the evidence points to a much different story, as an honest human being, he has to not only take the evidence in, but he does this brilliant synthesis of the evidence. And finally, he presents this case, which is irrefutable. And, of course, here's this mild-mannered guy, a sort of country squire figure. His father loved him, but despaired that he would ever amount to anything. Would he be a doctor or a parson? They didn't know. And then he goes on this wonderful trip to the Galapagos, and he begins storing up this data. Comes home, begins to realize that the real story is far different than the traditional religious version. And what does he do? Instead of publishing it and causing a stir and upsetting everyone, he sets about amassing an enormous amount of data about barnacles. He trains himself in biology in a way that he was not formally trained, amasses the data, and then finally publishes it, has this kind of unshakable case to present. And he's a great hero of ours for many reasons, but one of them is that integrity, that decency, which says if it's true, then we must accept it. It's not to be as we would like it to be, but as it really is. And in the process, has a fantastic family life, wonderful relationship with his children, treats his children in a way that years later they remark on how he let them laugh at him, at his expense. He was so secure. He didn't have to be this kind of alpha male dominating the household. And in many other ways, a wonderful friend to his colleagues, a person who had none of the kind of narcissistic concerns about sharing the credit of this discovery with another person.
I find a very valuable explanation in this book. That is to say, this is popular science at the best level. Intelligence is always honored, and nobody's written down to, but in fact things are rendered simple by getting to the heart of them, just where you need that kind of intelligent simplification. And I found, Carl, on a page in this book, whatever the page number is, indeed it is page 53, a paragraph which gives as good a statement of what natural selection is, and thus getting to the key idea of Darwin's theory of evolution, as clear a statement as any I've ever seen. And so I ask you to read it.
Okay. Here goes. The ability of the environment to nurture and sustain large populations, the so-called carrying capacity, is of course finite. As the number of organisms increases, not all will be able to survive. There will be a stringent competition for scarce resources. Slight differences in ability, imperceptible to a casual observer, may spell life or death to the organism. Natural selection is a great sieve, straining out the vast majority and permitting only a tiny vanguard to pass its heredity on to the next generation. Natural selection is far more ruthless than the most callous and resolute animal breeder in determining the genetic makeup of future generations. And instead of the measly few thousand years since the domestication of animals began in earnest, natural selection has been working for billions.
And ultimately, or I shouldn't say ultimately, but up to now, it led to us. Though even that's a kind of anthropocentric judgment.
Yes.
It suggests that there's something about us which is better than all those other
You
animals.
might just as well say, up to now it led to the 10 million species that are on the Earth today.
Or up to now, it led to the Drosophila melanogaster.
Yeah, melanogaster, absolutely. It led to all the organisms on the Earth today, and who is to say which of them will be around 10,000 years from now, never mind a million.
But one thing that one can say, and I am to say, that we are distinctively different. You and I and Ann are sitting right now in a building, sitting in a radio studio, and we're talking into microphones, and we're being heard by many hundreds of thousands of others.
And no chimp has built buildings or microphones
and
or
next
radio.
to us is a piano, which has been in here for the last few months.
That's all quite true. But
And we're talking in a language that is far more rich and complex than any other animals, even our close ape neighbors, can manage.
But cold comfort.
Aren't we then superior?
Cold comfort to get from that. Because if you go back 10,000 years ago, no radio, no microphones, no building, no piano, and yet humans are here and biologically, as far as we can tell, identical to how we are today. So being able to build a building or a piano or a radio,
or write a book like Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors.
Write a book like Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors cannot be the defining characteristic of humans. If there is a defining characteristic, it surely isn't the modern technology, because humans existed long before that technology.
But then it must be some defining characteristic which has enabled the kind of great leap forward that we've taken in the last 10,000 years.
Well, we share 99.6% of our active genes with chimpanzees.
Yeah, that's a real stopper.
That's a real stunner, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it's a 0.4% difference. Now, I think we have more intelligence. So it's a difference in degree, not in kind. But that little increment in intelligence, the net result is everything you see around you. And so we like to tell ourselves how wonderful we are because we've accomplished all this. But in fact, I think that we are far more a part of the fabric of nature than we care to admit to ourselves. And when, all of these Western philosophers have said, well, we have religion, we have ethics, we have politics, we have art, we have dry cleaning, we have things that none of these other creatures could ever possibly have, and that's what makes us special.
We have indoor toilets.
We have indoor toilets.
Some of us.
Some of us do, but not all of us
not
do.
all of us
and
do.
not all, and a lot of our human ancestors did not.
You know what Aldous Huxley said about this? Shortly before his death, Huxley wrote an article for some popular American magazine talking about how the world has improved since he was a young man. And he gave 10 major improvements. The first of them was deodorants.
Really?
He said when he started in life, people smelled. And they no longer do, at least not in the circles in which he moves.
It's a very interesting question, by the way, why we've decided that that body odor is offensive. Because surely chimps do not decide that their body odor is offensive. And as we talk in the book, there are certain molecules in, I don't want to be too vivid, in human underarm perspiration.
Yeah.
That are sex attractants in related species, and so you wonder if that offensive odor that Huxley didn't like played a vital role in the propagation of the species that led up to Aldous Huxley, but many generations earlier.
And I have a theory, which is that Huxley was not really decrying body odor as it exists on the skin, but the mingling of body odor with wool and cotton and linen and all those other fabrics in an age, by the way, where dry cleaning was not up to the state that it is now.
Things do tie
And
together.
so I think that we created the need, first of all, not to smell like animals, and then we also created the clothes that make us probably smell worse than we would have ordinarily. And then we talk about how isn't it great that we have deodorants, but we created that need for deodorants also. Just a theory of mine.
It's a very interesting one. But clearly, whether it only began to happen 10,000 years ago or 20,000 years ago or only happened over the last 500 years, we have transcended our animal heritage. We've become very different from what we were 10,000 years ago.
Those are not identical statements. To say that we've transcended is a much stronger statement than to say we've become something we were not
We live
before.
differently than our grandfathers to the nth living 10,000 years ago lived.
Yes, but
We
that's probably...
live differently than our grandfathers, period.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
the changes in my lifetime, my 43 years, are truly radical.
Yeah.
And my grandmother, who lived to be 102, her lifetime covered everything from the fastest you could go would be in a sailboat or on a horse to the Concorde, and beyond that, and to Voyager. So, yes, there has been radical change, but that radical change cannot be defining because my grandmother was just as human as I am, and her grandmother was too.
To be sure.
That doesn't work.
There are so many questions that are in the air at the moment, and a crucial one, and one that your book directly addresses, is just what we've got in common with and how we differ from those near anthropoid relatives of ours. And there's been much study of primates, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangs, gibbons, bonobos in more recent years. In fact, Franz de Waal, whom you quote a good deal, was on this program perhaps a year ago together with some other primatologists who were meeting in Chicago at the time. I think when we return from some impending commercials, one thing they don't have in the rainforests of Central Africa, where these various primates still flourish more or less, after those commercials, we need to talk about primate studies. Not only in terms of what they tell us about those primates and their lives, but what they tell us about ourselves. And we'll be directly back to Carl Sagan and Ann Druyan after these words. And we return. Why did I say retold? Because there's a story that needs telling, and you will shortly tell it. We return to Carl Sagan and Ann Druyan. Their new book, Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, A Search for Who We Are, is published by Random House and is readily available wherever they sell real books. And it's one you will certainly want to read. The writing of, the popularizing without cheapening of science and of the scientific vision is a very, very difficult thing to do, and the two of you have done it superbly here, and that's no great surprise to me because you've done it before. Let us come to primate studies, to primatology, which you are so interested in and around which you build so much of the second half of this book. What can we really, before we go to particular studies, what really is the value of looking at all of those other apes?
Well, first of all, thanks for the very kind words about the book. Coming from you, it means a great deal to us. We look to the primates, of course, because, as I said earlier, we share so much in common with them. We're genetically so similar. And it would be foolish to think that there wouldn't be something to learn from them. What's interesting to me is that traditionally we would study baboons and gorillas and chimpanzees and draw all kinds of negative conclusions about, there was something distasteful about the idea that we were related to them, the way they conducted themselves. What more recent primate studies, ones that have been conducted with greater sensitivity and understanding of the natural social organization of these beings, reveal, is that it's not just the brutish and dominance, hierarchy, artifacts of that culture that we share, but also there are traits of real kindness, compassion, ethics on a moral order which I think is demonstrably superior to our own ethics.
Well, tell me what to look for when I go again, as I have rather often done, to what I take to be one of the most fascinating corners of Chicago, namely the Great Ape House at the Lincoln Park Zoo, where you've got a large colony of chimps and of gorillas, and separately maintained a colony of orangs. If I look at the chimps or the gorillas, where will I find moral concern and sensitivity? In what kinds of behaviors?
Well, in the chimps, especially those chimps, are probably a little bit more crowded than they're used to being, and in those stressful situations, it's remarkable that the female chimps, for instance, even though this is no feminist paradise, the females take a lot of abuse from the males. However, in these stressful situations, when the males are reaching for the nearest rock and picking up the rock to throw at another male, it is the female who, at great risk to herself, will reach up and pry open those fingers and disarm the male in an act of, I just think it's remarkable, first of all, that they're willing to do this considering the abuse that they get, but also it's a kind of something that resonates with our own experience.
She's saying,
with
don't
females.
fight, be nice.
She's saying, come on, boys, calm down, don't fight, put down that rock. And so
You're
that's
going to hurt somebody.
But among other species, for instance, the macaques are almost saintly, and this was demonstrated in a series of experiments done in the 1960s, in which macaques were offered food as a reward for electrically shocking their fellow macaques.
Mm-hmm.
And regularly, 60% of the macaques would rather go hungry than shock and inflict pain on a fellow macaque. In one course of the experiment, 87% of the macaques refused to hurt another macaque, even though they were starving. They were starved for as long as 2-week periods, no food, and they still wouldn't do it.
The inevitable comparison, as of course you know, is to Stanley Milgram's research, in which you get 95 or 90% of all humans who are asked to shock other humans as what is ostensibly part of a psychological experiment, do deliver the shocks.
Precisely. And there, it's not a question of, I'm going hungry. I haven't seen any food for 2 weeks. I think I may have to shock this other macaque, this other human. No, there it's, I'll get $5.
Yeah.
From, and I'm being...
But also I'm participating in a scientific experiment.
Yes,
this is
and I'm being told by the authority figure, science. The alpha figure of the moment, that, oh, it's okay, they don't really feel it, it's fine, do it. And I'm willing to do it.
When you're hearing, in the Milgram experiment, when you're hearing the anguished cry of the supposed victim, he's actually in league with the psychologist.
And he's not really getting shocked, but the subject doesn't know that.
And he's saying, I have a heart condition, this is going to kill me, please stop. And then some of Milgram's subjects are reluctant to go on, but as long as Annie says, the authority figure says, oh, the experiment must continue, the responsibility is mine, then they, oh, okay, fine, I'll shock this guy to death, no problem.
You know, I must tell you a small side note. I don't think I ever told you this. Milgram did those studies at Yale when he was an assistant professor at Yale, and I was an assistant professor in the same department. And in fact, he came to us really rather aghast at how much shocking behavior, how shocking was the shocking behavior of his subjects. He had expected far more of them would quit. Yeah. And he wasn't sure he should go on, but he was urged by, not so much by me as by some others, to go on because he was on to something interesting and new. What he was on to is man's capacity to injure others. You're now saying that, at least compared to macaques, we have a greater capacity to do intra-species harm than they do.
Well, if the experiment is reversed, if macaque scientists were offering the same deal to humans, it's very clear that we would not be, Milgram experiment shows, we would not be as compassionate to our members of our species as macaques are to theirs. So the argument that humans have some monopoly on ethical behavior and all these other animals are just beasts and beneath contempt is clearly a human conceit. It's wrong. And how many other of the purported distinctions of humans are also wrong when we take a close look at how animals behave?
Come to some other areas. A basic area, love, sex, family, paternal urgings and impulses and so on. How do they compare to us? How do we compare to
Well,
them?
of course, it's a very broad spectrum. And if you're a Hamadryas baboon, if you're summoned, if you're a female and you're summoned by your mate for any reason, if you don't respond instantaneously, you can literally have your head bashed in. However, there are also gibbons. Gibbons truly mate for life. And the way gibbons manifest their territoriality is they don't urinate on the ground to say, this is my turf. They don't menace anyone approaching. They sing songs, these wonderful arias that echo through the forest. And the married partners sing duets. And they sing all through their married life. And when one mate dies, usually it's the male, the female never, ever sings again. There's almost a kind of operatic quality to the whole gibbon life cycle. The alpha male, the one who is really the dominant figure in the group, he sings, and there are kind of moments when he declines and when it's time to transfer power, to pass the mantle, where we imagine these operatic power transfer arias of the gibbons. Now, nobody knew this, of course, until gibbons were studied in their own environment, and all of this information is only a product of investigations of the last few decades.
Are they more out of Verdi or out of Wagner? What?
We were imagining Verdi because it was so familiar.
Sounds like Verdi, doesn't it?
Yes, it's more Verdi. It's more schmaltzier. You know, it has a kind of a more family style kind of thing. But there may be some... when I think of the baboons, the Hamadryas baboons, that's more Wagnerian to me, actually.
They are...
Well,
the males are quite domineering.
Very domineering and brutal, really. There's a kind of brutality there that... Well, you saw Pat Buchanan at the Republican Convention. You saw that kind of... To me, that was very much the Hamadryas baboon platform come to life.
I guess I'd better ask you how so.
Well, in that... And I want to be careful to say this, because I'm not... It's easy to demonize Pat Buchanan. But this was a naked appeal to division, to resentment, to stop those females, put them in their place. Let's, there's a battle going on here. He said, make no mistake. It was a kind of he was responding to what he perceived, I think, as a threat to his group's domination. Now, there's something, you see him saying it, and you saw the men on the floor giving really what were primate pant hoots in response to what he was saying. They were, whoop, 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 like that.
Were they really?
They really were. And it was
wonderful.
So striking. Now, rather than just demonize Pat Buchanan, because I know in myself that I know it feels good sometimes to hate. It feels really good to feel superior, to look at another and say, aha, they're all wrong and I'm right and my group's great. This is another legacy from our primate past. And so, in other words, not to idealize it, not to say it's all saintly macaques or happily married gibbons, but it's all of it. It's all of it. We are part of the
But I would
entire
argue,
fabric.
here we're going to have a little bit of disagreement, perhaps, but that would be fun anyway, wouldn't it? I would argue, quite apart from Pat Buchanan, I didn't actually see the speech, I read about it, but if you take the Republican platform and its original stress on family values as they played through the convention, that they were talking to something about which we all ought, in fact, to be concerned. The American family has, in many ways, come apart. The ultimate measure is that children are at risk, not only children of the ghetto, but American children generally, who are badly parented compared to how they were parented half or a generation ago, who are less educated than they ever were before, and who live in a world that grows increasingly violent and dangerous to their very survival. There's reason to be concerned. Just as certain kinds of primates are very attentive to their offspring, we have every reason to worry about what's happening to our offspring. And if the Republicans were talking to that, I think they were talking about something legitimate and important.
Well, there's no question that our children are at risk. But let's think of the ways they're at risk and see if simply urging men and women to stay together and raise the child is the solution if no other aspects of the society have changed. A major problem is perinatal malnutrition. Around a few months before birth and the first years after birth, if you don't have enough to eat, you get permanent learning deficits, you have attention problems, you have social compatibility problems. This occurs in people of every ethnic group, and it's a lifelong disability. Now, a family staying together, if there isn't enough money to prevent malnutrition in the baby, doesn't solve this problem. Another problem is the extremely poor quality of education in many parts of America, especially in poor neighborhoods. Another is the unavailability to a large number of people who want it of Head Start and related programs. I could go on, including the fact that the United States is not best but 19th in the
23rd
world.
now.
23rd now, even worse,
We're slipping.
in combating infant mortality. Now, there are lots of aspects of the problems that children face, the bill for which we're going to have to pick up in the next generation, that are not solved in any way by rhetorical appeals to family values. They can only be solved by the government helping these families, because it's not a question of, even if you didn't have a compassionate bone in your body, just a simple cost-benefit analysis would be sufficient to show it's in the national interest to prevent these disabilities in children.
Yeah, I mean, let's look at what Pat Buchanan was doing 10 and 12 years ago for all the last decade. I never heard him say, you know, let's peel off a little bit of this money that we spend keeping the military-industrial complex going to the tune of $1 trillion. Let's peel a little off, and let's fund Head Start. Let's not pretend that ketchup is a vegetable. That was his administration that was trying to sell that.
Well, he wasn't president, though he did work in the Reagan White House.
Did you ever hear a discouraging word about that? No, not a single. No, there was no. No, you see, what I object to is there are people who want to pick out enemies and demons that they can point to and give everybody a good time, sort of stirring up those hatreds, but they don't have a constructive thing to say about the problem. Yeah. And that's the whole. That's why
to tie this discussion to the primates beginnings. See, I would say that what Pat Buchanan was trying to do is to make an appeal to ethnocentrism, the idea that our group, whichever we happen to be born in, is the best, to xenophobia, the idea that all those other groups are terrible, to dominance hierarchies, salute the alpha male, the top of the hierarchy, and know your place and don't be uppity, all of which we can see in our primate relatives. Not only that, these and sexism, these kinds of behaviors have adaptive value. Millions of years ago, it was very much to our advantage to divide the human species up into lots of small groups of a few dozens each, and to have mutual hostility between these groups.
Explain. This is back to the evolutionary analysis of our origins and of our behavioral repertoire. Why did that once have more adaptive value than it may now have?
This is an argument that was first put forward by Sewell Wright at the University of Chicago. And essentially, it's that life is in a kind of bind. Evolution is not foresighted. It's adventitious. And so it only addresses the current problem. And that means that what you really want to do is to have a wide range of different constellations of genes in order to prepare, in quotes, for any possible contingency. But evolution doesn't ordinarily work that way, because you only have to deal with the problem before you. If you divide up into small groups, there are sampling errors, statistical fluctuations, which give you a wide range of different constellations of genes, so that by accident, one of them is pre-adapted for a range of possible future contingencies. And because the groups have a certain degree of exogamy, a certain amount of mating between the hostile groups, even though they nominally hate each other. You know, it's like in Romeo and Juliet and Rudolph Valentino's The Sheik. You find members of the hostile group surprisingly appealing.
The alien woman is always worth the raid.
That's right. And so for those reasons, it makes sense. Xenophobia, ethnocentrism, dominance hierarchies, that partly for other reasons, makes a kind of evolutionary sense. But now we're in a very different situation. Now we have world-transforming technologies. Now we are in very large groups. Now the dangers of ethnocentrism and xenophobia are extremely worrisome. Now is the wrong time, and that's why I applaud Annie's characterization of Pat Buchanan as representing the Hamadryas baboon political platform.
As you look at what evolved in the wired-in, stamped-in behavioral programming of the higher primates, and as you look at man, what does emerge, if we are linked to these close cousins, what does emerge is a great deal of what once was called instinctual aggressiveness, or might now be called essentially genetically programmed aggressiveness, which emerged for its evolutionary, for its survival value, and which persists as given in our very inherited neuroanatomical structures and biochemical bases for the activation of certain behavior patterns, which leads to a very serious problem, one that I know that both of you have been much involved in and much concerned with over recent years, namely that man does seem to be primed, does seem to be programmed for intra-species aggression, just as are many of our ape relatives. And that intra-species aggression, given our higher intelligence, it is a greater intelligence than those apes have achieved, and the technology that we have developed through the application of that intelligence, and the fact that that technology has gone on to develop a technology of destructiveness, which is totally incomparable to, in its vast efficiency, to the pounding of other people with rocks or whatever. All of that, I've lost the structure of my sentence. What that brings
Not
you
a pretty
to,
sight, is it?
what that brings you to is the terrible question of man's innate hostility towards other members of the species, and the fact that we do organize in groups which ideologize in ways which render the stranger even more abhorrent than he might otherwise be, thus the specter of war.
And beyond that, the fact that our technology permits us to kill without confronting the gore and blood and guts, which missiles is ordinarily inhibiting.
Missiles are a wonderful way to get around ordinary compunctions.
That is just like a computer game. Press a button, people die, you never see them, nothing to worry about.
We've got some commercials coming, but we've laid the ground for what is, I think, the ultimate question about whether we can master our nature and march into the sunlit uplands of a transcendent future, or whether we are, in essence, fated to destroy ourselves, whether by this route or by yet another, namely the despoilation of the very environmental setting in which we flourish. We will be directly on to both of those questions and both of those prospects with Carl Sagan and Ann Druyan after these words. And back to Ann Druyan and Carl Sagan, who have co-authored the brand new book, Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, The Search for Who We Are, and that is published by Random House. We've come to what is inevitably the payoff question, and we've come to the twin specters of environmental despoilation and war, which could more or less wreck the human species. Now, we thought about the latter, about war, nuclear Armageddon. We thought about it more a few years ago than we have lately. we now congratulate ourselves. Well, the Cold War is over, and both sides have agreed to take down the large portions of their nuclear weaponry, and so we're out of that woods, and we're out of that crisis, and that's a relief. Is it really, Carl, a relief? Are we done?
Yeah, I mean, we're not done, but boy, it's a relief, I'll say, to have these two hostile nations armed to the teeth with more than enough weapons to destroy the global civilization, maybe even the human species. To have that ended is a big relief. I feel it emotionally, and you know, Annie and I got arrested for protesting U.S. nuclear testing in the face of a Soviet moratorium, and we were deeply involved because we were deeply concerned.
I want to say, to hand out what I think is a justified compliment, that you didn't end the Cold War, but you made a small and significant contribution, and just how small, or maybe larger than small it was, but in the working out of that scenario concerning nuclear winter, I think you helped to further scare us properly about what danger we were in.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because just 3 weeks ago, we heard Alexei Leonov, who was the first human ever to walk in space, and who was a general in the Kremlin, say publicly that it was, in fact, the nuclear winter and Carl's coming over to the Soviet Union and talking about it that absolutely, completely undid their resolve. He said that after Carl left, they looked around at each other and they said, it's over. We have no nuclear option. And he asked this vast audience of astronauts, cosmonauts, and aerospace people, did they realize that Carl and the nuclear winter was really the key in their changing their way of thinking? And I was tremendously proud.
Yes, I hadn't heard about that. Well, it's all the more striking.
Thank you both. But to try to respond patiently, precisely because we are smart.
And no other species has done so much intra-species killing as we have done.
Well, no other species except some of the social insects has war at all. I mean, the chimps have, they have skirmishing. They have, to make a bad joke, guerrilla warfare. But there's no main force combat. We're the only ones who do that. So yes, you might say, this is such a dangerous sign, and of course it is. But I'd like to indicate how we view this in Shadows. There is, as we've been saying, a range of propensities in us, often mutually contradictory. For xenophobia and ethnocentrism and sexism and aggression and violence, but also for ethics and love and altruism and tender care for the young and foreseeing the future and making tools and all of that. They all simultaneously reside within us. Think of society as a kind of stencil, which gets placed on top of the propensities, and the little holes permit some propensities to come out, and others are suppressed. Different society, different stencil, different constellation of predispositions that are permitted to come out. Our job is to design a society in which the propensities that are permitted to come out are consistent with our survival. Now, you might say that's really tough to do, but there are true reasons for hope. Think of the changes that have happened just in the last few centuries, that is on timescales much quicker than any possible evolutionary change, and therefore that must reflect what those propensities are. It used to be, not very long ago, all over the planet, that monarchies bowing and scraping to the alpha male was the standard political metaphor and construct. Now, and supported by religious and political leaders and philosophers and Aristotle and everybody. Now, except for a few pathetic echoes of pomp and costume in England and a few other places, it's gone. No one thinks that the divine right of kings exists. We have moved beyond that. Think of chattel slavery, the idea that some people naturally and by right and by divine fiat own other people. Aristotle thought it was terrific. All sorts of clergymen thought it was terrific. We fought a war over it here. No one believes that anymore, or hardly anybody. Chattel slavery has essentially disappeared. For those reasons, and the end of the Cold War is another hopeful sign, and the greater awareness about sexism, the improved standing, still far to go, of women. All of this is a sign that we are capable of the most profound change. You might have thought that with dominance hierarchies so important in our nearest relatives, the chimps and the bonobos, that we were wholly unable to emerge from that. But that's not the case. We are very malleable. We can bring out the best in us, and it's our job to design societies which bring out the best and suppress the predispositions which may once have served a role, but now are obsolete.
There's a wonderful quasi-philosophical and also biotheoretical question that follows from this. You're saying we've got the capacity to surpass the impulses or the stimulus response patterns that are stamped into us neurologically, biochemically. Is that we have volition, will, and the capacity to alter our nature or to select which portion of our nature will and which portion will not be honored by a matter of through a process of conscious choice, is the same, since we've been looking at parallels between ourselves and our near animal neighbors, is the same possibly true of any of those higher apes?
Well, I think when the macaque decides to forego the reward of the food, to go hungry, rather than to hurt a fellow macaque, that's a moral choice as valid and as impressive as anything that we've come up with. So, I mean, I think
it's one instance.
I think
it's
one thing
impressive,
we have,
but if you look at the actual way in which, say, chimps or gorillas or bonobos live, do we see any evidence that they are able to honor the better angels of their nature and put aside?
There's a famous experiment that Conrad Lorenz reported of some tropical fish in which the males carry the hatchlings, the babies, around in their mouths.
Yeah.
Here is the father fish swimming along with its baby in its mouth, and it comes upon a piece of food, and it's hungry. What will it do? And they said they could see the gears turning inside, metaphorically speaking, inside the brain of the fish. Long pause. Fish spits out baby, eats food, then gathers up the baby and continues. Now that is a decision that the fish had to make, probably straining its intellectual powers to the hilt. But that business of...
You really attribute that to decision and to ratiocinative process rather than to something instinctively built in on a reflexive basis.
But are you sure that that distinction doesn't apply to us? That is, how much of our decision-making is, if you want to use the word reflexive, take heroism. Heroism is something greatly admired in our society. We give congressional medals of honor. But talk to the hero. What does he say? Does he say, I sat down and added up the pros and cons, I made a cost-benefit analysis, and then decided to throw my body on the grenade? No. He just did it. It just seemed like the right thing at the time. I don't mean to take anything away from courageous and heroic people. But are we sure that it's really a rational decision, or is it something largely built into us?
Well, that really raises or skirts the whole problem of consciousness and identity and individuality and volition and everything else. Do you want to imply, suggest, hint that despite the fact that we move as if we are free beings and think of ourselves as having choice, that we are in fact just very, very complex protoplasmic computers?
No, I think there is a degree of choice. I think the idea that the choices that we congratulate ourselves on may be less a matter of some particularity, some personal individuality, and more some product of an ancient legacy, which we are just beginning to understand, I think that doesn't undermine the importance and the value of the choice at all. You see, one distinction that I think does apply to humans is that we seem to have this overwhelming need to distinguish ourselves from everyone else. We keep saying we're the only ones who do this, we're the only ones who do that, we are better than they are. That in itself is something that's very similar to other primates, that need to make our group the group that, we're the good guys, we know what we're doing. But I think it may be a delusion, and if I do something heroic, I want to understand what it's really about. I don't want to just pat myself on the back and me it's because I'm just such a wonderful person. I want to really understand all the integuments of that act. And I think that it may have a much more ancient lineage than we're prepared to admit right now.
We have in this new book of yours, Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, only the first of a projected 3-volume work. I want to hear a little bit about those other volumes in just a moment. First, I do want to now say that we're opening the phone lines. And shortly after some commercials, we'll start taking telephone calls. If you want to join us, now is the time to give us a ring to pose a question or offer a thought. 591-7200 is the number for conversation with Carl Sagan and Ann Druyan, authors of Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors. 591-7200. The area code, of course, is 312 if you are calling long distance. Now is the time to call. The lines are open. If you don't get through, do please call again shortly after we say goodnight to some prior caller. Say a word or two about the other works to come. This book takes us only, in essence, to the dawn of the human species.
That's right. And if we are to really understand ourselves, there's a long period between the beginning of humans and the beginning of civilization that we have to understand. That's the time when we humans were hunter-gatherers, no fixed abode, no property, small itinerant groups, just like the chimps. But if we can judge by contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, some very great and important differences. And that's one of the jobs that we...
So you're going to pick up the story in the next volume at about 200,000 years ago.
Something like that.
And that's the second volume.
That's the second.
And where do you end the second volume, and what happens in the third?
Well, the second volume ends with the settling down of the human species, and the third volume concerns itself with the invention of agriculture and the rise of civilization.
And how we can...
It brings us to the present moment
Brings us
and our
right
present
up to
time and
it.
our present dilemma.
That's
and
right.
some prescriptions for
I get the sense that the
solutions.
second volume must be largely written, am I right?
I wish. Not quite yet.
But
I did want to
it's
say
planned and
something
projected.
in response to something you said earlier, Mel, and that is that we came away with a sense of optimism, the likes of which I don't think I've ever felt in my life. And we began this search with a sense that no matter where it led us, we would go, and we wouldn't flinch, and even if there were areas that we disagreed about, and even if there were challenges to some of the self-defining ideas that we have, we would meet them head on. And I came away feeling a sense that our species has so many resources, and that we are so adaptable, and that the legacy that we have is really so valuable that I really think that we are going to. Nothing is ordained, and nothing is written, and scientifically you can't possibly say what's going to happen. But I have a sense that we have what it takes to get us over.
There's an old, simple conversation ender that used by Yiddish speakers. Indeed, my parents used to use it rather easily. Very simple. As men ved leben, men ved zen. If we live, we'll find out.
That's right.
And that's really what we're talking
That's
about.
right.
If we live, then we'll see what happens to us. Sure, I guess I want to share that optimism. Indeed, I feel more optimistic now than I did 5 years ago, for the very reason that Carl was referring to earlier. The end of the Cold War is kind of reinvigorating in one's hopes for mankind.
But it's also unleashed a kind of Pandora's box of...
It has indeed, it has indeed.
Of nationalisms and superstitions and group hatred.
Yeah, and there's reason to worry that some of those groups that are at each other's throats may get their hands on nuclear weapons.
That's right.
But here again, it seems to us that understanding where we came from and understanding what our closest relatives do in the course of their lives is very helpful for understanding, for example, the ethnic hatreds, the ethnic, quote, cleansing, close quote, that has raised its ugly head.
Terrible phrase that's been raised in Yugoslavia. Yeah. We will pause next to the last round of commercials, and then after that, directly on to the phones. 591-7200 is the number, and if you're not getting through right now, that's because all the lines for the moment are taken. But do please continue to try. Some calls get processed and don't get through, and for that matter, if we say goodnight to somebody, then there is for a moment a line available. 591-7200 and on to your calls, right after these words.
This is Sagan. What is it that you see? You were talking about the hope for the future. I'll mention a couple and see if that spurns you on to talk more about that. If we had the world not to overpopulate any further than the numbers we're at now. If we use our technology to build cultures that will start to share resources so we don't burn down the rainforests, etc. What might some of your solutions be for the future of humankind on planet Earth?
Well, the basic question, to restate it, is what should we do now?
Well, I'm really glad you asked that question. That's a wonderful question. Let's talk about population. Now, there is something called a demographic transition, which seems to be applicable to every culture on Earth. And that is that when you raise the status of women, when women are educated, when the per capita income is just slightly higher than what it is now, you find a precipitous drop in the birth rate. Now, this is remarkable how true it is in cultures, in all the cultures of Earth. And it's not enough just to raise the per capita income, because if you do that alone and the status of women remains low, then you find that the birth rate does not drop as swiftly as you want it to. So one of the things that I would do, and this comes from a whole variety of sources, research in working on this book, is I would say if there was only one change that I could make on Earth, it would be to raise the status of women to absolute equality with men. Women have a kind of mediating influence on men. This is true males and females in non-human primates, and they tend to be more long-term in their thinking. They may have their own raging hormonal imbalances, but not the kinds that men do. They're not inflicted with this overdose of testosterone, which makes them want to beat up anyone who gets in their way. And so I think that if I could just do one thing, it would be to change the status of women. I'd really be interested to know what Carl has to say.
I entirely agree with that. I want to stress we're not talking about giving political power to a woman prime minister who has managed to beat the men at their own game. We're talking about the empowering, the equality of women across the boards. And on the demographic transition, what we're talking about is not raising the per capita income of everybody, but of the poorest people, because it's the poorest people who have the largest birth rate for reasons which are well understood.
Our thanks to that caller, and we'll go quickly to another on 591-7200. 591-7200. You are on the air. Good evening.
Good evening.
Yes, sir.
Carl and Ann, you two strike me as a couple of true believers who are no more willing to question the theory that you base your beliefs on than were the ministers of the 19th century whom you so roundly criticize as being closed-minded. I'd like to raise a couple of questions and see how you respond.
Sure, fire away.
Regarding this theory. Number one, how do you explain the switch from asexual reproduction to sexual reproduction?
Well, first off, let me say that in no way challenges the validity of biological evolution, whether we're able or unable to explain the fact that many species, by no means all, reproduce sexually today. The Darwinian concept of evolution and natural selection is profoundly verified, not just by the fossil record.
Well, where are fossils in transition?
Excuse me. Not just by the clear experience of artificial selection, but by the record in the nucleic acids, which is obtained by DNA sequencing, in which we can see the similarities and differences of organisms and trace their evolutionary past,
in other words, you've got this
history.
Theory with a gaping hole in it.
There's no gaping.
It doesn't cause you to question the theory.
There's no gaping holes. You're talking about the absence of intermediate forms in the fossil record.
That was one problem.
The fossil record. Well, let's talk about each thing that you have problems with. If there's time. Well, just a minute. You raise one, and then when I'm about to answer it, you rush off to the next. Let's do them one at a time. The fossil record is necessarily incomplete because of the processes of erosion, but particularly, it seems to me...
And all the fossils in transition got picked off.
Sir, nobody said all the fossils. You're going to lots of intermediate forms.
You're going to have to put aside your creationist primer for a moment and either listen to the answers that you raise. Well, sir, I will thank you for the call, but I think it would be unproductive to continue because our caller, I fear, is too ready to do battle rather than to listen. He rather reminds me of Pontius Pilate. He asks what is truth, but does not stay for the answer.
Let me at least respond to one of the caller's concerns. Consider artificial selection. I mean, there is something intrinsically implausible about evolution, particularly if you think that the world is only a few thousand years old, as the biblical chronology would have it. Then the idea of one species flowing into another is absurd. We never see that in our everyday life, we are told. But consider artificial selection. Consider, for example, the variety of dogs on the planet. We have dogs ranging from Chihuahuas to Great Danes. We have dogs specialized for herding sheep, for going into holes, for catching birds that are shot down, for taking care of the babies, for guarding the house. Tremendous variety of dogs on the planet.
And in fact, they are man-made dogs in a way.
Exactly. Where did they come from? We, humans, made them by controlling which dog shall mate with which. We like the characteristics of Rover. We like the characteristics of Spot. We now introduce Rover and Spot to each other so that we can have the products of their progeny. Other dogs with characteristics we don't like, who are unpleasant to us, we do not encourage their reproduction of. And in the short period of 8,000 or 10,000 years, we produce this immense variety of dogs. Now, compare that with 4 billion years of biological evolution, not artificial selection, but natural selection, which goes into not just the overall characteristics and personalities of the dogs, but into the biochemistry, into the internal organs, selecting what works a little bit better, just the faintest bit, in the competition of organisms. And then it is clear that the beauty and diversity of life on Earth can emerge. But if you don't buy 4 billion years, you don't buy evolution.
And we ought not to get trapped in something which tends to be an American phenomenon, namely the insistence that there's an opposition between religion and scientific theory, and more particularly evolutionary theory. There is only if indeed you stand by a fundamentalist reading of the Bible, particularly of the Old Testament.
That's right. If you're a biblical literalist, then there are problems. If you believe that God may have used metaphor in dictating the Bible, or that people are fallible and didn't get everything right, then there's no problem.
Or if you believe, as some Christian theologians say, that God works through history, that means he also works through biology. He works through the history of biology.
Absolutely. And the deist point of view, that God establishes the universe and the laws of nature and then allows it to unfold. All of that, so that's a wide variety of different religious views, are all entirely consistent with evolution.
And thus it happens that Charles Darwin is indeed buried in Westminster Abbey, his family invited to lodge him there by the Church of England.
That's right. In fact, the family wanted to bury him at home, and the Church of England said, no, you must bury him in Westminster Abbey with Sir Isaac Newton.
Yes.
And we say in the book, you've really got to hand it to the Church of England. Here they were saying, those of you who do the most to disprove the truth of what we say, we reserve the highest honors for. And that is also what we love most about science. I'd like to take issue with what the caller said. He said we are true believers. We are not true believers. We are painfully aware of our ignorance and of the limits of our understanding of the universe. This book is our attempt at creating a kind of coherent story informed by the findings of science. But the thing we love about science, we revere its methods and the fact that it knows that it can always be wrong and that it's always ready to revise itself in the face of stronger evidence. And so not true believers at all, but merely people who have used the methods of science to find something out about the way we are.
And we'll go back to the phones now. There are 1 or 2 lines available. If you've been trying to reach us, do please try again, and do so rather quickly. 591-7200, the number. You are on the air. Good evening.
Yes, sometime before 10 o'clock, both of your guests made mention of Pat Buchanan's speech during the Republican convention, and how that related to certain primal reactions, certain primal environments, for want of a better term. How do you respond then to the actions that occurred in the Los Angeles riots earlier this year, and how do they fit into that same pattern? If you're going to evaluate Buchanan in that way, how do you evaluate the riots?
Well, before my guest responds here, let me get a fuller sense of your own answer to your question. What meaning do you put on the Los Angeles riots?
Well, I think they fall into the same. I believe they would have to fall into, if you evaluate them along the same lines, they'd have to fall into the same category, that man in some way, shape, or form still has an inherent violence that has to be expressed in some way, and it is directed. I don't know whether it's necessarily cultural or purely instinctual or what, but there certainly is a not. I can't agree or abide by the somewhat positive view that Dr. Sagan has taken over how man is progressing along those lines, looking at how violent we get even in an environment that seems to be overall in the world fairly positive. I mean, the United States has got a pretty good lifestyle even for some people who are not even in the best situations. Mm-hmm. So that's how I would view it.
All right, let's get a response.
Well, I see traces of our ancestry when I look at the White House. When the president gives the State of the Union address and he's riding high in the polls and he comes striding down the aisle, and the members of the House and the Senate all push each other aside to try to touch the alpha in a kind of demonstration of it's just so absolutely reminiscent of the kind of behavior that you see among non-human primates. I see it there. I see it in Desert Storm. I see it everywhere I look.
Only it seems to be though on what would be considered positively Republican issues. I mean, that's how...
No.
Okay,
no, absolutely not. And I'm glad you pointed that out. No, I see it not just in Republican issues, but what's interesting is that historically humans have been willing to accept this model when they look at the poorest and the weakest among us, the people who have the least. They say, yes, I recognize there's the trace of the non-human primate, but not when they look at the Queen, which is also another manifestation of that. What is that but it's the most naked biological heredity? This is alphahood by virtue of genetic...
But yielding to power, or yielding to the dominant hierarchical figure, isn't quite the same as the outbreak of violence that threatens to destroy the very surround in which you exist.
Yes, I think
there's a difference between seeking to touch the garment of the president as he comes down the aisle in Congress, and bashing in heads in Los Angeles.
But is there a difference between organized warfare and the disorganized warfare of Los Angeles?
See,
organized warfare kills more people.
Perhaps that's true, but is that also part of that same legacy? In other words, are we willing to see it there as well as willing to see it in Los Angeles or anywhere else?
Yeah, I think as long as we're willing to do this in an even-handed way, and to recognize that these shadows of forgotten ancestors run through the society, from the well-off and the powerful to those who are poor and powerless, then we have no quarrel. Our quarrel comes when people say, I see the beast, I see the jungle in the most disenfranchised, least powerful part of the population, but somehow are unable to see the same beast and jungle at the top rank of the dominance hierarchy.
I must ask you, just look to another world, not the world of working class and underemployed people in the Los Angeles ghetto. Think of a world that you and I know rather well. We've both inhabited versions of it for a long time. The university, academic life. Do you see any shadows of forgotten ancestors moving through academic life?
Well, there's no question there's a dominance hierarchy there. The young instructor hopes to be promoted to assistant professor, who hopes to be promoted to associate professor, who hopes to be promoted to full professor, who hopes to be promoted to full professor with endowed chair, and there's no question that those high up in the hierarchy tell those low down in the hierarchy what to do. Graduate students are in many places exploited, and so on. It's just a natural part of human life.
What about the uses of hostility, or the sublimated uses of hostility?
You can see that at universities as everywhere else. You can see dominance hierarchies, not just in academia. You can see it in motorcycle and big city gangs. You can see it in big city political leaders and the bureaucratic hierarchies there. You can see it in Machiavellian Italy. You can see it in the military. You can see it in corporate hierarchies. Well, it's a big part of our society.
Well, do you look forward to a time when hierarchy will have disappeared from the structure of human affairs?
Well, that's a good question. First off, I think it's fair to say that there are some circumstances in which hierarchy is essential.
And is functional.
And it's functional. Warfare is an example. You may say that warfare is unnecessary, but this is one of those cases where as long as there's one group which is interested in warfare, everyone else must have at least minimum preparation.
But might you not argue that in the things that are less instantly deleterious, such as, for example, the structure of business or the structure of educational institutions, that hierarchy is also functional and is somehow a part of our social organizing, the equipment by which we do social organizing so as to get the business of life properly handled.
Absolutely right. But there is such a thing as too much hierarchy. There's such a thing as too little hierarchy. If you must delegate power because you have a large organization, some kind of hierarchical organization is necessary.
There is also, to use a distinction that Erich Fromm made many years ago, the difference between rational authority and irrational authority.
Yeah, it would be stupid to say that any authority is dangerous and we should avoid it. There are perfectly good reasons why we have authorities, but in a democracy, the people are supposed to rule. So that means that they are the masters, if you want to think of it that way, and the government is the servant, and we don't see much of that.
I mean, what is the Bill of Rights but an attempt to obviate the power of the alpha to push everybody else around? It's like leaving the primordial seas for the land. It's saying that we know that power is corrupting and that the alphas tend to get out of control. And we know that the rest of us need to be protected. That's really why we revere the Bill of Rights, because it's precisely that.
I think a footnote is required. You've both often made reference tonight to the alpha. Your reference, of course, is to a terminology used by primate researchers as they observe primate bands.
And using the first letter of the Greek alphabet to denote dominance, the dominant male in the group.
The dominant male.
There are female hierarchies, but they tend to be less hierarchical, which is another reason why women should be shoulder to shoulder with men.
We will pause. A last quick round of commercials, and then we'll be directly back to Ann Druyan and Carl Sagan, authors of the new book, Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors. And we'll go instantly back to the telephones, 591-7200. You are on the air. Good evening.
Yes, good evening. I have a two-part question. Would your guests support medical experimentation on primates as a way of solving human illnesses and disease? When you take a baboon liver out of a baboon and give it to an infant child, it's great for the child, it's bad for the baboon. And from what I hear you say in the first hour, that could be a very ethical, upstanding, altruistic baboon. Second question is, shouldn't you support, or shouldn't it not appall you to have human experimentation on humans to save that ethical, upstanding macaque that has 99.4% of our genes? I'm sorry, I just don't buy the argument you're putting forward.
I'm not sure I followed the second part.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, nobody said that the baboons were particularly ethically upstanding.
Oh, well, macaques then.
Okay.
Macaques were the ones who didn't
torture each other. And the macaques don't share 99.6% of our genes. You're thinking of the chimpanzees.
How about chimpanzees? They're great, too.
Well, I hear a derision in your voice, and I don't know, what the source of it is.
Well,
but what I'm saying is are you saying that the experiments are not true, that what they found is not true, that they're not reproducible?
No.
Or are you saying that it bothers you to think that you may have more in common with them than you ever thought?
No, my question to you is a very simple one. Do you support, let's say, killing a chimpanzee to save a human life? It's a very simple question.
That is a very deep question. And I don't have a glib answer for you.
And it gives you that much pause.
Yeah, it gives me pause.
Really
just as you can ask the question, does it pay to have one human give up his or her life for another? And under what circumstances is that fair and just?
How about giving it up for a baboon? Does that give you the same moral pause?
No, it doesn't, in part because we are much less closely related to baboons
Well, how about a gorilla?
than we are to each other. Let me try to give a more general answer.
Okay.
There are experiments on other animals which are cruel and heartless and cannot possibly be justified for whatever benefit emerges. There are other experiments in which there is not excessive pain or not any pain at all, and in which we learn something which can save the lives of many human beings. I would not want to be the one who tells the parents of children whose lives are in danger that their children have to die because we will not sacrifice or even inconvenience some non-human primate. I don't for the moment suggest that these are easy decisions, but you recognize that decisions of this sort involving humans only happen every day. And in the case of the non-human primates, similar difficult ethical choices have to be made.
Our thanks to the caller, and I also hear the contention or the
it
anger or
touches
at least
the nerve.
annoyance in his
It
voice.
really does.
Which is an interesting phenomenon. Carl has been on this. You've been on this program once.
Sure.
Carl has been on, I suppose, 5 or 6 times over the years. Whenever he commits a book, he shows up. And I've never heard this sort of response before. Certainly not when you're functioning in your astronomical cosmological mode.
But this is more powerful.
When you turn to your biological mode, this seems to stir people up a little bit. How do you account for that?
Well, I think it's very clear. What we're talking about in astronomy is austere, glorious, beautiful, distant, does not instantly touch our emotions in the sense of everyday behavior. When we talk about human beings, when we talk about politics, when we talk about the possibility that we are very closely related to beings that many parents rush their children past at the zoo so they will not see something unseemly going on in the cages, that's a very different story.
I think that's true, although when Carl talks about astrology, he very often gets the same response, the same affect.
Astrology rather than astronomy.
Or UFOs or ESP.
Or abductees or...
When I'm skeptical about those things, then certainly I touch the nerves of people who believe them.
But you know, what this is about is the displacement, the increasing displacement of human beings from the center of the universe. And every step we take away from the center, and usually it's science that's delivering that bad news, that we're not at the center of the universe, we're not created separately, that we are a part of the fabric of nature and not so special as we seem to need to think we are. It's painful. And I think it has to do with psychological concerns and very deep feelings that many of us have about ourselves.
Freud made that point about himself, although I thought he was rather wrapping himself in the mantle of Copernicus and Darwin. He said there have been 3 great insults to man. First was the Copernican revolution, which undid Ptolemaic astronomy and the notion that the Earth is the center of all the universe. And the second was Darwin's discovery that we are linked to other animals, which is what we're talking about tonight. And the third was his displacing human rationality by pointing up the great prominence of the unconscious. I'm not so sure that his was just as much an insult to mankind as the other 2 may have been.
May have been, yeah.
But interestingly, we've got a fellow coming here on Wednesday night who's just done a book titled Freudian Fraud. This is the psychiatrist E. Fuller Torrey, who argues that Freudianism, though it may have some utility in therapeutic application, has done considerable injury to the very structure of human society. And there will also be a representative of the Chicago Institute for Psychoanalysis joining in that discussion. While I'm on programs to come, I do want to say that tomorrow night, being the beginning of the Jewish holiday Yom Kippur, I will not be here, at least not in live form, though we are playing some recently recorded tapes. One of them with Walter Isaacson of Time magazine, who has just done what is an astonishing and fact-filled and possibly quite critical biography of Henry Kissinger, titled simply Kissinger, a Biography. 591-7200 is our number, and we'll go quickly to another caller. You are on the air. Good evening.
Yes, Dr. Sagan, I'd for a moment like to call on your position as a member of the advisory board to the Drug Policy Foundation to ask you a very simple question. Is the so-called war on drugs a rational policy, or is it an irrational policy?
Well, I think I think it is mainly irrational. The whole idea of a military metaphor on this kind of problem is, I think, a great mistake. To give one case which is very clear, that there's a wide range of drugs, some less pernicious than alcohol, some extremely dangerous, and so we must be very careful about lumping them all together. But let's consider the following case. There are, all over the country, there are people having terminal cases of cancer or AIDS, who are given, for example, huge doses of chemotherapeutic agents, which force them to be nauseous, to be unable to take food, which then leads rapidly to their dwindling away because they can't eat. Now, it's well established that marijuana counteracts this nausea, and in the few cases where it's permitted, remarkable, or which it's done illegally, remarkable benefits accrue. Is it rational to forbid patients who are dying from taking marijuana as a palliative to permit them to gain body weight and to get some food down? It seems madness to say we're worried that they're going to become addicted to marijuana. There's no evidence whatever that it's an addictive drug, but even if it were, these people are dying. What are we saving them from? So that's an example of a highly irrational official government position on at least some parts of drugs. We could argue, case by case, molecule by molecule, but at least some parts of it are clearly irrational.
As a footnote to what you just said, it might be noted that 2 months ago, a 70-year-old grandmother in California was raided in her own kitchen cooking marijuana cookies to be given to AIDS sufferers. And she's facing 5 years in prison. Quite a term for a 70-year-old grandmother, I would say, and indicating the irrationality that you just pointed up with respect to marijuana as medicine.
Sir, I thank you for the call.
Thank you.
The conversation just took an interesting and unexpected turn. I wasn't aware of your being on that commission.
Well, it seems to me the injustice is so great that if I can, help a little bit, I'm happy to do it. The idea of demonizing everyone who takes officially unapproved molecules, but encouraging the taking of officially approved molecules, chiefly ethanol, seems to me very odd. How do we decide which ones are safe and which ones are dangerous? The number of people who are killed by ethanol every year is in the hundreds of thousands. The number of people killed by marijuana, including all users of it, is, as far as I can tell, zero. Does the policy reflect the realities?
We are almost out of time. And in our conversation, we've dealt with certain aspects of this book and not yet others. In the space of 45 seconds, what particular theme or what particular area of scientific exploration that we haven't talked about at all
Yipes.
should we at least put on the record right now?
Wow, quick, help, Carl.
I would just say that the whole idea of understanding ourselves by looking at our relatives, and I don't just mean the primates, but all the way back, insects and before that, is exhilarating. I find it is so exciting, so broadening, and some people may think this is a misuse of the word, so humanizing. Instead of making me grumpy to discover that I'm related to the other animals, I think it raises the significance of human beings, that we are so closely related to so many species and such a gorgeous panoply and diversity that the Earth's life is graced with.
That's right. To be part of a chain that's 4 billion years long is nothing to be ashamed of. In fact, it's really something exquisitely beautiful.
And it's kind of heartening to know that one has so many relatives out there.
That's right. Big family.
The book by Carl Sagan and Ann Druyan that we've drawn from tonight is just published by Random House. The title, Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, A Search for Who We Are. It's been a delight to have you both back here again. Thank you
For us too.
so much for joining us.